So with the photos that we took last week, right? So we did a photo assignment on depth of field, and we paid a lot of attention to manipulating exposure control methods like shutter speed and f-stop. How many people took just phenomenal photos last week? 25 great photos. All right, so not a lot of hands going up, right? So part of the problem with your photo assignment last week, part of the difficulty, not problem, but difficulty is that this is a nighttime class, right? And so you're taking photos, you have kind of low light situations, and in some cases where you had to increase depth of field, you had to do things like close down your apertures, right? And as you close down your aperture, yeah, you do get more depth of field, you get deeper depth of field, but as you close down your aperture, you start to lose a lot of light. Right? And in crime scene situations, that's kind of some of the difficulties we play with. We're taking photos at night where it's kind of dark. We need deep depth of field, and the best way to control depth of field is to close our aperture down, which decreases our light even further. Right? So we start getting into situations where we just don't have enough light. So guess what we use a lot in crime scene photography? The flash. So what we're going to talk about for the next couple of sessions is going to be flash techniques, flash photography techniques. All right? So we use the flash. In fact, in crime scene photography, we probably use the flash for over 90% of the photos we take. Even photos we take during the daytime. Even if it's outside on a bright sunny day, we will still sometimes use the flash, depending upon if we have shadows, for example, that we need to get rid of. So we're going to talk about flash techniques tonight, all right? Don't worry, I'll put those other photos back. All right, so let's talk about flash. Very likely test question would be, why do we use flash? So why use flash? There's three main reasons why we use flash in crime scene photography. So that test question, why do we use flash? There are three reasons to use flash. Well, those answers are listed here behind me. First and foremost, the reason we use flash the most is because we just need more light. Quite often, we're in darker situations. You might be in a crawl space under a house trying to take photos, or you're out in the shed of someone's house where they've stashed a body and it's just dark. You need more light. Right? Or you're taking photos out in a dried up wash out in the desert at 2 o'clock in the morning and there's just no light around. You need more light, and flash is one way to get that light. Another major reason why we use flash is when the color of the thing that we're taking a photo of is relevant. Because if you're not careful, you can actually make things look colors that they are not in fact. If you remember, we discussed if you're taking a photo of a bruise, for example, under fluorescent lights. Remember, fluorescent lights are not true white. If we look up at these fluorescent lights, they are emitting a mixture of red, green, and blue, but they're not what we call true white. True white is an equal mixture of red, green, and blue. We know that these fluorescent lights have what color in a larger abundance? Green. There's more green. So if you take photos of things under fluorescent lights, it's going to make everything slightly green shifted. So a bruise, for example, if you look at a photo of a bruise taken under fluorescent lights, it looks yellowish green in color, which makes that bruise look older, aged, for example. So what would we do to make sure that that bruise, which is that bright red-brown color, actually looks bright red-brown the way it's supposed to? Use a flash. You might turn the lights in that hospital room down or off and then take a photo with a flash. Another major reason that we use flashes in crime scene photography is when we're dealing with shadows. We either want to move shadows, eliminate shadows, or actually in some cases, we're going to use the flash to create shadows. This is especially true when a little bit later on we talk about photographing tire track impressions and footwear impressions, because to actually photograph those impressions, we actually need shadows in the photo to be able to see the three-dimensionality of that impression. And we use a flash to do that. Right? So When is color important, right? A very likely test question might be to name 3 or 4 things that you might take a photograph of at a crime scene where the color of that thing is relevant, it's important. Well, I've listed a couple. One of them is a vehicle. For example, if you respond to a crime scene to photograph a vehicle, maybe it was a vehicle involved in a drive-by shooting. Right? Maybe the drive-by shooting happened at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And as that car sped away, we have witnesses that report having seen a vehicle that was gray in color or silver. Now, maybe by the time we find the car, maybe it's nighttime. Maybe it's under a street lamp. Have you ever looked at a silver car under a street lamp? Yeah. If you ever look at a silver car next to a beige car under a street lamp, they look the same color. You can't tell. Because the yellow light, what we call sodium light from a street lamp, will make a silver car and a beige car, and sometimes even a white car, look exactly the same. However, if we take a photograph of them under white light from a flash, I can definitely tell the difference between the silver car, the beige car, and the white car. So that's an example. Wounds. Wounds. We mentioned before that a bruise, the coloring of a bruise is important. Coloring of abrasions can be important. Or what about tattoos? Is the coloring of a tattoo important? Yeah. When do tattoos come into play? When are tattoos particularly useful? Try to identify something, exactly right. Normally, if we have a decedent, so someone who dies, their body goes to the medical examiner's office, right? At the medical examiner's office, they are tasked with doing a couple of things. First and foremost, the job of the medical examiner's office is to determine what is referred to as the cause and manner of that person's death, right? Cause and manner of death. Cause of death, manner of death. And by the way, in Maricopa County, this is something that should be in your notes, so let's make sure we add it. In Maricopa County, there are 5 manners of death. This is going to come up on our final exam a little later on, so let's make sure it's in our notes. So there are 5 manners of death that can be written on not a birth certificate, a death certificate here in Maricopa County. You guys, you can name what they are? Suicide is one of them, right? So a person takes their own life. So suicide is one. Homicide. Homicide meaning that one person kills another person. Accidental. Murder and homicide are the same thing. In fact, actually, let's talk about that for a moment. Homicide and murder. Okay? It's important to understand that all murders are homicides, but not all homicides are murders. Murder is a criminal act. You have intent to kill someone, your actions caused their death, and you were not justified in causing the death of that person. But there are homicides which are not criminal. Non-criminal homicides, for example, justifiable homicide. If one soldier shoots another soldier in combat, that is homicide. Homicide is defined as one person killing another person. If a soldier shoots another soldier in combat, we call that justifiable homicide. And so it's not criminal. Most times. As long as it follows the rules of engagement, for example. But that was one example. Yeah. Or what if you run someone over in your car? If it was accident and it wasn't negligent, that's what we would call a non-criminal homicide. Now, if you're driving through the neighborhood at 50 miles an hour and you run over a child in a small neighborhood, now we have negligence. So now it becomes criminal homicide. All right, so going back to our 5 manners of death. Murder is not a manner of death. That's a crime. A manner of death is homicide. So we have suicide, we have homicide. I think, Polite, I heard you say accidental, right? So accidental. You accidentally fall down the stairs and you die. That's one, right? Break your neck, you die. What else? Natural causes. So I developed cancer and I died as a result of complications associated with that disease. And then the last one, the word we use is not suspicious. You're on the right track. We call it undetermined. Undetermined means we can't say for sure. Can't say for sure. These typically come into play when we have a questionable death that we can't tell if it's suicide or homicide.
Like Jesse Wilson?
Like Jesse Wilson, potentially could be.
Oh, I came up with a guy that his second wife had passed away.
Okay.
And his first wife had been considered undetermined.
Okay.
They went back and exhumed her and turned her.
Yeah, I think I saw the same episode. Let me give you an example that happened here in Phoenix. In Phoenix, several years ago in the South Precinct, there were several police officers who were under internal affairs investigation for fraudulent reporting of time. So the South Precinct was under investigation. There were about 5 officers who were being investigated. During the course of the investigation, one of the officers under investigation actually started to cooperate and answer questions from this internal affairs investigation. So we have this one officer who's kind of starting to answer questions in a way, starting to turn against these other officers. And guess what? That officer ended up showing up dead. So he was on duty, he was on patrol, and he was shot and killed right near the Arizona state capitol. So his body was found right near his police car. He had been shot in the head with a shotgun. So then the question became, was that a self-inflicted gunshot, or was he shot by somebody else? So was it a suicide or was it a homicide? Now there were several questionable things about that particular case. One in particular was the fact that the gun was not where it's expected to be. When a person shoots themselves with the shotgun or rifle, where would you expect to find the gun?
Right in there.
Pretty close, usually either right in their hand or close by, right? You know, I've been involved in a number of different homicide-suicide investigations as part of my job. You know what I've never seen in a suicide? I've never seen a person like shoot themselves and then like, shut the gun! Right? And I'm not trying to make light, but that was part of the problem. This officer shows up dead, and if it's suicide, why is the gun not right there? I don't remember what his rank was.
He was a sergeant.
I do know that he called his wife that same night, and when his wife was asked about it, she said there's no way. There was no problem. So the his remains went to the medical examiner's office, and they conducted a death investigation, which is what they do. And initially, when they submitted the death certificate, they listed the manner of death as what, do you think?
Suicide.
Undetermined. The initial death certificate was listed as undetermined, meaning they couldn't tell for sure. Because in some cases, it can be very hard to tell. You have to look at the totality of the situation, not just the wounds that are present, but things like, where's the gun, right? Did they leave a suicide note? Did they, what sort of things were happening? Well, there were inconsistencies. And so initially, the death certificate was issued as undetermined. Now, several people at Phoenix Police Department were very unhappy with that determination because it was believed by many that this guy was killed, that it was a homicide. Interestingly enough, about a year and a half later, the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's Office reopened that case. They conducted another death investigation, and they changed the death certificate from undetermined, and guess what the cause of the manner of death was listed as this time? Suicide. Suicide. Again, the Phoenix PD, many members of the Phoenix PD are still very unhappy with that manner of death.
There was a lot of pressure put on them.
It was that case was in the news quite a bit. It was pretty substantial.
Yeah, a kid that used to work for me was a security guard down at the Arizona Center. It was actually at the Arizona Center.
Uh-huh.
And he was not the one that reported the death, but he came upon him.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's now a Mesa police officer.
Okay.
Yeah, it shook him up.
Yeah, it was pretty brutal case. Now, in that situation, it wouldn't have been difficult to identify the decedent, even with a pretty bad gunshot to the head and face, which I'll show you some photos of what those look like a little later on this semester. When a person shoots himself in the head and face, it's not there anymore, right? Now, keep in mind, when a body goes to the medical examiner's office, I said before that the medical examiner's office, part of their job is to determine cause and manner of death. By the way, cause of death was gunshot, manner of death, suicide, homicide, right? But the other job of the medical examiner's office is to identify the remains. They have to figure out who this person is. Just, a few minutes ago, we were talking about how the medical examiner's office, through work with, I think DPS did the DNA in that case, was able to identify the remains of Jesse Wilson and Buckeye, right? Because they had the remains, they're sent there. First thing that's going to happen with those remains is the forensic anthropologist is going to determine, is this person male or female? Are they an adult? Are they a child? And then they're going to look at, are there any injuries, things like that? And then if we take a look at missing persons records, okay, we determine that this person is a an adolescent or a child, maybe younger than 10 years old. We're looking for a male. So then we go back through the records and go, okay, how many 10, 11, 12-year-old boys have gone missing in the last couple of years? We pull those up. We get a look at their dental records. We can take a look at their medical records. We can take DNA. If we have family members, we get DNA from the family. Ultimately, they were able to identify Jesse Wilson's remains that way. Well, sometimes it's not that complicated, right? If we have a body that's found, if you're dead and you are the only person that lives in your house, and we show up at your house and we find your dead body, it's not a mystery as to who that person is. But they still do need to identify you. Just because there's a dead body in your house doesn't mean it's you. It could be somebody else, right? So if the head or face is missing, we need some other way to identify them. Typically, the way a person is identified is that a family member, the closest living relative, is going to show up at the medical examiner's office, and they're going to identify the decedent. The way they typically do it is they'll take photographs of the head and face of the person. And then they'll show those photographs to the family member and say, is this your loved one? Can you identify this person? It's not like you see on TV where they go down into the cooler and they pull the body out of the drawer. That's not how they do it here in Maricopa. Now, here's the question, though, right? Here's the question. What if the head and face aren't there to photograph? Let me show you some examples of what I'm talking about, right? So let's take a look at a couple images here. All right, so sometimes heads and faces just, they don't look the way we want them to look. Not that one, no. Okay, so for example, all right, so we'll look at this photo a little later. You guys have taken Dave Craven's fingerprint class. Dave took these photos. Here's a great example of a person who's hit by a train, right? If that body's taken to the medical examiner's office and we're trying to identify them, if the family shows up to try to identify the decedent, there's no head or face there to identify, right? So what do we do next? You guys mentioned we could do fingerprints. Now, fingerprints could work, DNA could work. Another thing, too, though, is to just look and see if they have any identifying marks. Do they have any unique birthmarks? Do they have any unique tattoos, right? For example, let me show you.
Medical scars.
Yes. Let me show you. Let's see. All right, so this gentleman here, all right? This again, this is, I think, another one of Dave's cases. This guy got hit by a car. No, it's not one of Dave's. This guy got hit by a car, and then he went underneath the vehicle, which is what happens, by the way, quite often. When you get hit by a car, there's one or two things that can happen. Depends on the size of the vehicle. A sedan. Let's say you get hit by like a Toyota Camry. You're gonna go across the top. They're gonna hit you. You're gonna hit the hood. You're gonna bounce across the top. Now, if you get hit by a larger vehicle that has a larger clearance, let's say a pickup truck, a large passenger van, when you get hit, the vehicle is going to push you down, backwards and down, and then the vehicle is going to go over top of you. And what happens in a lot of cases is the body, your arms or your legs or whatever, get caught up in the suspension or on one of the axles, and then you just get dragged and you get chewed up, right? And so that's what happened with this particular gentleman. He went underneath the car, and it takes a bit, right? If you've ever gotten in a car and you have to slam on your brakes, it can take a bit to stop. And in the meantime, the person underneath the vehicle is just getting chewed up. And so that's what happens in this situation, right? So this guy got chewed up pretty bad. We're going to look at more of these photos of this gentleman a little bit later. But he was pretty messed up. In fact, if you look at his head and face up here, it's pretty tough to identify him based on his head and face, right? There are other marks. But one of the things that was found at the crime scene was his arm. There was a tattoo on his arm, right? So we can identify a person by identifying marks, tattoos, birthmarks. And so when we photograph those as things, it's important to remember that the coloring of that is also important. Unfortunately, this photo is not a great photo of that tattoo. Why is that? There's a couple of things, right? One, there's a shadow kind of obscuring the tattoo. So if you were to show this to the family, it's kind of hard to tell. Actually, there's a name right there. It's kind of hard to read, but I think it says James, right? So here's the thing about photographing tattoos. And this is the thing about photographing any wound or tattoo, if you want to put this in your notes. Whenever you photograph any wound, any birthmark, any sort of tattoo, always photograph them with a flash. Always photograph them with a flash. One of the main reasons for that is the coloring of that tattoo or that birthmark or that wound is important. I'll get to it in just 1 second. Another thing to remember whenever we photograph a wound, a tattoo, a birthmark also is we need to include in the photograph something else that's missing from this photo. We need to include a scale in the photo to show the size of the object or the feature. And the other thing we should also include in the photo is a color card. Remember the color correction cards that we've used before? You actually should, so if you were photographing a tattoo on a person's upper arm, for example, if you hold a color correction card and a scale right next to it so it shows up in the photo, you can ensure that the coloring of the tattoo or wound, whatever it is you're taking a photo of, is correct. And then the scale gives reference to its actual size. So always use a flash. And always include a scale and a color card. Very likely test question. Bill's going to get your question in just a second. Very likely test question. Name 3 or 4 things that you would need to photograph where you need to use a flash to ensure you get proper color. Well, before I mentioned cars, wounds, tattoos, birthmarks. Another likely question is, besides using a flash, what else do you need to include in the photo of wounds, tattoos, bruises, birthmarks? And those 2 things are what?
Scale.
Scale and a color card. Now, Dulcie, you had a question.